Hi everyone, it's Pam Le Noury. I'm Head of Expedition Operations at Noble Caledonia, and we have with us here today Dr. Olav Orheim. Olav was the professor at Bergen University, and he's also been in the Norwegian Polar Institute for much of his life. He's been studying icebergs his entire life, and we thought in lieu of being able to send you down to Antarctica with us and go and explore the icebergs for ourselves, how fun it would be to have a chat with Olav about icebergs in general, and of course some news that's been quite topical lately with one particularly naughty iceberg down near South Georgia. So I just wanted to speak in general terms about what they are to us on a voyage. It's something we try and see every voyage. We'll go to specific sites to see them from the Zodiac and from the ship. And I just want to share with you a quick few pics over here. This is the sorts of scenes we might see down in Antarctic. We certainly would see icebergs normally as big as your house. We'd see them as big as our vessel, bigger than our vessel. And I remember telling a friend before we went down a few years ago in 2018, I said, we'll definitely see one as big as your house. And I said, we'll see one as big as the big shopping mall, which is very nearby to where we live. And this person didn't believe me at all. And what we actually saw on that voyage near Elephant Island was an iceberg spanning more than 30 kilometers, which is bigger than my whole city near Durban. So the photos just, you can't even take a photo of an iceberg that big from the ship. We have to be a safe distance away, of course. So the photos were completely unhelpful, and we actually used the ship's radar to see this iceberg via the ship's radar. So this yellow line is the outline of that particularly big iceberg. And here, if you can see on the map, there's Elephant Island in the top, the ship's track in black. And this green line is what we saw on the iceberg through the radar. So bigger than Elephant Island. And it was just absolutely mind-blowing. So we go out of our way to try and find icebergs to show people, to cruise with it with the ship and with the Zodiacs, always from a safe distance, of course. But it's such, the grandeur of an iceberg is, you can't really beat it with anything else down there. And it's one of the highlights. So you probably have heard of over the last couple of years, in 2017, from the Larsen Sea ice shelf in the Weddell Sea, there was this huge iceberg that broke up an ice sheet, and it was called the A68A iceberg that broke away. Originally it was more than 4,000 square kilometers, and it's been weaving its way north. It was the biggest iceberg in the world at the time, and I think the fourth biggest ever recorded, weaving towards South Georgia. And of course, it all sits still over the winter time while it's all iced in, but then in summer it starts moving again. And this last summer, you probably heard quite a bit about this big iceberg that's been on its way to South Georgia and could be wreaking havoc there. And when you look at this map now and you see South Georgia in the middle and this iceberg in the south being just about the same size as South Georgia, you can really appreciate why there would be huge concern. And so it's so nice that Olav has agreed to have a little chat with us about what is going on with that iceberg and what do you think is, how's this whole story going to pan out over the next season or so?
Okay, Pam, and thanks for being here. Let me just start by saying something about these very big icebergs, which are called tabular icebergs. They're flat on the top, and they have, as you said, huge areas. Some are bigger than one. This one here is the size of Delaware in the United States, or like any other big area. It is huge. And the reason why they're so big is they break off from these floating ice shelves, which we call them in Antarctica, which are really floating glaciers, but of also enormous size. And as these glaciers float out at sea, more than 100 kilometers, in some cases more than 500 kilometers, that is 300 miles. In that process of floating outwards, they also flatten out and they become, if you like, less crevassed. And so these are quite huge slabs of ice, about 250 meters thick. That's about 700 feet or so. And as I say, many, many miles, so sometimes tens of miles big. Now, unusual to have them as big as A68. A68 comes from the number, incidentally, is that it's the 68th of that size or big one that has come from that quadrant of the Antarctica. So these have been followed now for about 20 years. So over 20 years or so, we've only had 68 big icebergs from that quadrant. So it's not something that happens often. You're not likely to meet one when you're down there. You're 100% certain to meet big ones, though. Not that big, but you will meet tabular icebergs when you go to the Antarctic, always. And it, as you say, is fun. Now, A68 was 2 months ago heading straight for South Georgia, and being the same size as South Georgia, there was an expectation this could cause damage. Now, fortunately, all the penguin colonies, practically all, are on the other side of the island. And so perhaps it wouldn't do much damage, but perhaps they would come round and maybe something would really block up the whole area. But now we know that after that satellite photo that you showed there, we now, of course, have more recent information. And a few weeks ago, it started breaking up. And this is from a very recent article, which shows, if you look at the outline of the iceberg, you see it at the bottom left, you see it where it was in October, and you see where it was on the 7th of December, still the same shape, 13th of December, the same shape, but then it was caught by a southeast flowing current and flowing away or along the you might say, the 200-meter depth contour of the island. And so it started going around, and in that process, nobody's been there studying it, but we can be pretty sure that what's happening is that partly it's gone aground for small periods of time, and that in the swells and the seas that are there is enough to start it breaking up. And now you see, if you lower right here, we see suddenly that it is in many different pieces. All the pieces retain the number A68, but then they're given small suffixes after that to show that it's the same origin, but now they're separate. And one, A68E, as you see, is quite close to the island, and others are drifting quite far. And what we now expect will happen is that maybe some of these will swing northwards in current and maybe even come and block some of the entrances to the bays and the fjords on the northern or northeastern side of the island. But that we will see over the next few weeks. And if so, it can cause problems for some penguin colonies. If it keeps on drifting eastwards into the main current around Antarctica, which goes clockwise around Antarctica, then these icebergs will just keep on floating for months, and maybe even for a year or two, the biggest ones. But right now, where they're stuck or partly being grounded, they're breaking up much faster than they would do if they were just in the open sea.
Yeah. And Olav, some of the newspaper articles were talking about the damage to the sea floor, causing other ecological damage, and also talking about all the freshwater input, changing, the structure of the ocean around there. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Sure. Wherever this goes aground, remember now it has a depth in the water of about 200 meters, 600 feet or so, and it may have a keel that is slightly deeper than that. And where it actually hits the ground, it will cause scars in the seabed. But South Georgia is volcanic, and the land, subsurface underwater land is also volcanic. So it's not as if it's going to scrape up a lot of sediments. It's just going to hit the rock, break off rocks. I don't think it obviously will. The animal life on the seabed, right where it hits, is going to be disturbed and maybe be killed. But if you look at the total area, it's not going to have any significant impact. If it has impact, it will be because it blocks the routes for the penguins to get out to get food. That would be the real impact, if there is any or at all of biological significance.
Yeah. So, I mean, just as a way of scale, right there on the southeastern corner of the island, you can see that little inlet there, that's Drygalski Fjord, which we could spend the entire afternoon cruising with the ship in and out. And so, although these little pieces still look quite small, in the scale of some of the places we visit, they're still absolutely massive. And then on the top here, where these bigger bays are, you know, you've got Grytviken and stuff in these bays here, still absolutely massive, even these small icebergs in relation to South Georgia. So, so interesting. Thanks so much for that update. Now, I know you were also involved in another project, which is quite interesting relating to icebergs, and it also affects a big city in my country, which was running out of water. Cape Town famously was declared a disaster zone a couple of years ago because of the droughts, and they were literally almost running out of water from the taps of just everyone in the whole city. So I didn't know you were involved in this project, but of course we knew about it around here. And tell us a little bit about this Southern Ice Project.
Okay, I was contacted by some people in Cape Town about 3 years ago, basically saying, "Are you still alive?" Because they'd seen that there was research done to tow icebergs to Saudi Arabia about 40 years ago, and they saw that could be of interest, not because they were sure that icebergs were going to work to solve the water problem in Cape Town, but as one of the many ideas. And since that time, I've been in Cape Town a couple of times for meetings, with especially with a fellow called Nick Sloan. And Nick Sloan is a tug and salvage expert. And he says, "Give me the iceberg and I shall manage to tow it." And he has enough credits to his name. He was the one who rescued and got the Costa Concordia cruise liner off the rock afterwards, and he's done many other projects, and he says it can be done. And so anyway, we met in Europe, or maybe a half a dozen times, more than that probably. And there are also investors who said, "We will try this." I'm sure the first ones to do this, the first iceberg will not be profitable, because there will be many uncertainties in this. We're talking about pulling a small iceberg compared to what we looked at now, but still more than 100 times bigger than humans ever have moved on the surface of the earth. So there's no experience in these big things, and they may be hard to move if we get into an eddy in the ocean, or if they break up because they are internal weaknesses, and there are many other uncertainties. And then when we get to Cape Town, we would go aground a long way from the shore, so there's a lot of effort needed to get the water into the system. But one iceberg would deliver something like, depending somewhat on its size, but something like a quarter of the annual need, or maybe even the whole annual need of Cape Town. And so the idea behind this is to just do it to fill up the basins again, and not to be doing this every time, but just use it to fill up the shortage, and hope for rain in the future.
I mean, you know, sub-Saharan Africa is going to have this water problem in perpetuity at the moment. Just systems aren't well designed for the water situation that we have in this continent. So what do you think? I mean, do you think that ever will happen? I know now it's no longer a state of emergency in Cape Town, but do you think it's still something that might actually bear fruit?
The calculations that would have been done on this, but as I say, there are some uncertainties, and they are big. But the calculations that have been done is that if those can be overcome, it would be cheaper to deliver iceberg water than it would be to do desalination. And it has much fewer environmental impacts, because desalination leaves you with a lot of salt that you have to handle. Whereas this iceberg, what we're doing is simply we're putting it further north. It's going to melt in the ocean anyway. Now we're taking it further north, and we're taking off the fresh water, rather than letting it just melt in the ocean. So there would be some local environmental impacts, but that would only be over a few square miles. So it would not affect the environment in general.
It's such a fascinating idea. It seems so outlandish to try and tow an iceberg up here and salvage the water from an iceberg. So it's so interesting. Thanks for that. And now
let me just say, as a small point, that if there's any place to do this, it would be Cape Town. It's the ideal place, because it's the ocean currents carries the iceberg quite far, close to it. So if it works there, if you can manage to do it there, then perhaps one could also use it to alleviate water shortages in Namibia and other places.
Yes, yeah.
There's a lot of
It's
potential.
just a short detour, you know.
Yeah.
um, so Olaf, just because you're also one of the only people I know, Olaf was mentioning that these tabular icebergs are flat-topped. And so whilst a lot of the smaller icebergs we come across, we wouldn't go close to them or anything like that just because of the risk of rolling. But these big tabular icebergs are quite safe. But you're still one of the only people I know that's landed on top of not one, not two, but multiple icebergs by helicopter. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that works and some stories?
Well, this started actually with a Prince Mohammed Al Faisal Al Saud from Saudi Arabia who wanted this research. And so he came up with money, and we had an expedition going to the Antarctic from the Norwegian Polar Institute, so, where I was the expedition leader. And so we said, okay, we'll do some iceberg research. And we had helicopters on board. And so we started landing on icebergs. And we found we could do a lot of work while we were doing maritime research at the same time. We had a lot of spare time of helicopter time to go out there. So we landed on lots of these icebergs. And that started research that for a couple of years was quite interesting. And Scott Polar Research Institute in the UK wanted to get in on this. And so we went on an expedition where also David Attenborough came along with his film team, not because of us. He was doing one of his Life on Earth in Life in the Freezer series, you know, but he was also very interested in his iceberg research. So we went out on an iceberg where he and his film team was then doing a story on what was happening with this. And it was still this idea then of getting it to Saudi Arabia, which we by that time incidentally knew was not possible because we would lose too much going across the equator.
Yeah.
But we weren't quite ready to give up on the research. So we were not talking about that result at that point. We were doing the research, and David was interested in this. And then we're sitting there on the iceberg doing filming and talking about this, and then fog comes, and suddenly we couldn't get off it. And next day, it took us close to 24 hours before we were back on the ship. And we had, of course, with us tents and food and sleeping bags. We were about 10 people on the iceberg. And there was no danger. The iceberg was big, stable. But when we got back onto the ship, we realized that this had got big news story in the UK, you know, David Attenborough about to die on an iceberg, stranded on an iceberg, that kind of headlines. We didn't know that, but of course somebody from the ship had alerted back to some media, and suddenly it was a media story.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, okay. Jeez, that sounds like quite an adventure.
We were together for about a month and got to be good friends. And many years later, I was involved in making a big exhibit in Norway. And I said, and it was on climate. And I said to the people who were making it for us, and we were doing it in English. And I said, let's get David Attenborough to do the voice for this and speak about these challenges. And these people who were professionals, they said, there's no way we can do that because David Attenborough, he works for the BBC and he cannot do this. And in any case, he wouldn't do that for a project here in Norway. And I said, well, I'll just write to him. And I didn't tell them that I knew him. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote to him and they said, of course I'll do that. I don't have a time to go to Norway, but if you come with radio people or with your tape recorder or whatever, I'll do it in London. And when I told these people, they didn't believe it. I never, ever have told them why he did it. But that was all because we spent the night on an iceberg.
What happens on the ice stays on the ice, you know.
Yes.
That's so great.
Incidentally, can I say one more thing? When people go down there
I'd love it.
And they see icebergs, there are two things you should watch for. The one thing is the size and the immensity of these things and the whiteness of it. But also when you look near the water, look at the blue color. Because when you get close to them, you see that these icebergs also are blue. And especially when you see places where they've been undercutting by the waves, or sometimes they're cutting into the icebergs. They have many different shapes. When they start to disintegrate, you have the dry dock shape, for example, where you cut in the middle. And there you can see the ice, and you see this beautiful blue ice that you see in the iceberg. because that's really the color of ice. So watch not just for the shape and the size, but for the color also.
You're so right. We've had some photographic expeditions down there, and you can have a group of photographers on your boat just literally working around an iceberg just the size of the Zodiac for hours, just snapping every angle and every little corner. The carvings that the sea and the weather does on these icebergs is so beautiful, and they're just, the big and small ones, they really are a highlight of our time down there. Olav, thank you so much for your time joining us and telling us some wonderful stories and obviously great information about the Iceberg A68. So I hope you have a lovely evening, and thanks so much.
Same to you, Pam.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.